Hey everybody, this is JDGaming back today with another episode of Get Better at Yu-Gi-Oh! In today's episode, we will be discussing defensive options for various strategies, introducing the types of cards that you may use to protect yourself from your opponent, and as usual, you can find any of the articles that are related to this down below. There wasn't a particular article that made me think, oh, let's go and list all the different kinds of defenses. It's really just different articles that kind of elaborated on why would you use a hand trap versus a normal trap, what do you do when you get back row, like what's the effective way to use it, things like that. So it's like a good mix of things, so hopefully you'll find some of that stuff interesting. Anyway, let's get started. So first off, you gotta think, what exactly is a defensive card? And the best way to address that is to think about the objective of the game. As we discussed in our goal-oriented dueling series, most people try to win by having their decks do 8,000 damage or more to the opponent, clear the life points as a way of winning. And as a result, a card like Hanewata here that says you can discard this card to make any effect damage you take from this turn to 0. This effect can be activated during either your player's turn. A card like this isn't really considered defensive most of the time because you can't use it when your opponent's not playing a burn deck. So it's not going to protect you against most of the people you faced. Not to say you can't side this, but most people probably wouldn't find that very useful. I'm sure most of you would think that cards like Bottomless Trap Hole, Compulse, trap cards from throughout the eras of dueling like this, even the Solemns that are king right now, trap cards like this tend to be the defenses that most people think about, and that's because inherently the traps are designed such that you set them so that when your opponent does something, you can stop them in their tracks. It breaks up their combos, prevents them from attacking you, and ultimately keeps your plan intact and your life points safe so that you can stay in the duel and win. But with new cards in the game that are just resistant to a lot of traps and power cards like Twin Twisters available to take out multiple back row all at once, it's become kind of like a format where Heavy Storm used to be legal. People are trying to shy away from trap cards, but if you think about the top decks, do they really lack all forms of defense by foregoing traps? The answer to that question is a big, resounding no. Here are some examples of cards that aren't trap cards that have been played throughout the years that have a defensive function. Book of Moon is a quick play spell card, but it has the ability to go and thwart your opponent's plans. Hand trap monsters like Gores obviously have been feared because of their ability to turn the duel around when the opponent looked like they had no defenses left. And even cards in the extra deck like Stardust Spark Dragon or number 101 Silent Honor Arc that have immunity to destruction or other forms of removal have the ability to protect you and keep you in the game longer. But let's go a bit further. First, let's take a brief but detailed look at trap cards. We already went through the examples here, but the truth is we can sort these based on their function and their playability. If you take these cards like Bottomless Trap Hole, Solemn Warning, and Solemn Strike, as popular as they are even nowadays, they can be classified as reactive trap cards that must be chained to your opponent's summon. In other words, they're more preventative. If your opponent has their monster stick on the board and then you draw into one of these, you have the dreaded one-turn late syndrome where they can't do anything to help you get rid of a threat that has already been established onto the board. But then you have other cards as well. You have things like the Battle Traps, Mirror Force, and Dimensional Prison. These don't suffer as much from one-turn late syndrome, as you can draw into one of these and usually deal with a monster that's already on the board, as long as, of course, your opponent doesn't simply remove the trap card. So everything has its own benefit and weakness, whereas these preventative cards can prevent monsters from using their ignition and trigger effects to try to get rid of your defenses. These cards are actually able to take care of monsters that are already on the board, so there's a bit of an interplay that you have to consider there. And then of course, there are the fully chainable traps like these that can be played pretty much at any time, and these tend to be really popular because you can draw them whenever. Whether or not a monster already exists on your opponent's board, it will help you deal with a problem when one arises. So the concept of chainability is one that is actually based on a game function, the chain, and that's something that's really important to think about when you're considering defenses. But the next part of the video and throughout the rest of this is going to be stuff that's based more on terms that I came up with that aren't necessarily based on game mechanics directly. And that's the concept of passive defenses versus reactive defenses. We'll start with the reactive ones. If we look at something like Book of Moon, yes, this is a chainable card, but I would call this a reactive card because you're going to wait to see what your opponent does, and when they make that summon of a monster that could be used as a material for a summon or might activate its ignition effect, you're going to flip it down in reaction to prevent that card from doing anything. That's kind of like if you would wait for an effect failure or a ghost ogre and snipe the monster that's most problematic to you at the time, or even if you were to play max C when your opponent has a special summon lined up, or even just played a special summon effect that you chained this to. These are the reactive ones that are, for the most part, very chainable. You can see these two are fully chainable. These two are almost always chainable. I'd say the least chainable out of these is the Ghost Ogre, but even then they're fairly reactive because they're based on what the opponent does. You're never just going to throw down a Veiler just because you can. You're still responding to your opponent having something threatening on the board. Then we have reactive defenses that are less chainable. So things like Gores, yes, technically start a chain when their effects activate in the battle phase. Things like Battle Fader, Electromagnetic Turtle, and Honest as well. But if you take a step away from the idea of chainability, you'll realize that these effects are still reactive to your opponent when your opponent attacks your light monster. When they declare an attack, you go and activate these effects and you protect yourself. And between these, you still have to consider, between all 8 of these and any other examples of areas that I might not be touching on directly here, you need to consider what is the best option for you. Think of the situations that you need to solve defensively. What's hurting you? Is your opponent dismantling you with monster effects? Are they getting around you with big monsters that are destroying yours in battle, or maybe they are just killing you in one turn before you can even put together a comeback? Think of the kinds of problems you need to solve. Think of the reaction windows that these cards have and whether or not they will make an impact in the opportunity that your opponent gives you, and then see which options are best for you. And then there are, as I said, the more passive defenses. These I would think of as monster effects that either wall off your opponent entirely or float. So if you think of these monsters here, the commonality between all of these is that whenever they get killed, they replace themselves immediately with something that will protect your life points. And even if a card like, say, Spirit Reaper isn't as relevant, or Marshmallow isn't as relevant to protect your life because your opponent can remove monsters from the field, most of the time, you can come up with some sort of a floater that will end up protecting you fairly effectively. Think actually about the Burning Abyss PK Fire strategy. I mean, their Xyz monsters and all of their main deck monsters float, replacing themselves whenever they get destroyed, either by their own cards or by the opponent's, and that's what allows them to stay in the game. The reason I don't classify these as reactive is because whereas their effects may chain in response to something happening, I as the player don't have any option as to when my opponent kills my Tengu and gets that to float, or destroys my Breaksword and gets me the free PK monsters. So they're more of a passive floating effect whether or not they activate. Again, things that are more continuous, like Marshmallow or Spirit Reaper, can fall under this category, but these are the kinds of effects that you might actually see someplace in your main deck, in the core, or even in the extra deck. Moving on to that extra, we already talked about a couple good monsters here, but there are a lot of alternatives. Synchros have monsters like Colossal Fighter that just keep coming back if they die in battle, and other monsters like Cyframe Omega that protect themselves and potentially allow you to mount enough of an attack next turn to win. You have monsters like Silent Honor Arc that I talked about, but even cards like Abyss Dweller shutting down your opponent with an aggressive lockdown effect can prevent your opponent from putting together enough power to win the game. And then of course there are passive monsters that can't be killed that many decks have access to thanks to Xyz summoning. Things like Wind Up Zen Mines have been popular for a long time. Mech-Whipped Anganeer is another one of my personal favorites, but then there are cards like Sky Cavalry Centaria as well that have both a removal ability as well as an ability that keeps it on the board so that your opponent can't just take you down. And while we're talking about defenses, keep in mind that you can have a very powerful offensive play that prevents your opponent from doing anything to you. If, for instance, you were playing Burning Abyss and you got out multiple Dantes and Phantom Knights and, all these other cards on the board, your opponent might have no choice but to play defensively so that they survive the turn. You've heard the phrase, the best defense is a strong offense. Well, that very much rings true in this game if your deck's able to take control of the game and force your opponent into a defensive position. Similarly, cards like Raigeki that have the ability to turn the tide by getting rid of all your opponent's monsters can force them into a defensive situation, which would force them to try and play that passive, hide their life points role, whereas you can then capitalize on their weakness, go through with your main plan, and hopefully take them out before they have a chance to regroup. And that's going to do it for our discussion on various defenses that are available in the game. Obviously, I haven't hit everything that exists. Different deck themes will have unique cards within their archetypes that they can play. Certain strategies will be able to use unique spells and traps or monster effects, triggering things that normally people wouldn't think about and be able to make the most of them. But the whole point of this video, and really the series in general, is to get you guys thinking about some of the options that you have about you. Don't just think of the same cookie cutter methods that everyone else uses. When someone innovates something, take a look at it and think, why are they doing that? Can I learn something from them? Can I use that? Because as you can see from this topic on just defensive options, there are many different routes to take it, and as long as you keep the goal of don't die as your main plan, you'll find something that hopefully works best for you. So that's everything I have for now. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you thought of this topic down below, and if you have any other suggestions on future episodes of Get Better at Yu-Gi-Oh! This is JDGaming, and I'll see you guys next time.